Her billionaire husband, Dominic Vane, flew his pregnant mistress to New York for the birth of their baby and told his butler to keep his wife in the dark. He sat in the cream leather seat of his Gulfstream G650, cruising at 45,000 feet, and watched Lexi sleep across the aisle with her hand resting on the 7-month bump that carried the son he had always wanted. He swirled his vintage scotch, checked his reflection in the window, and dialed the estate, confident that his instructions to the staff would erase his wife, Zara, from the narrative of his new life. Before we watch Dominic lose every dime he has to the woman he underestimated, subscribe and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And have you ever seen a cheater get exactly what they deserved? Elias, Dominic said the moment the line connected, not bothering with a greeting. We are landing in 2 hours. I need you to ensure the guest wing is locked and the security feeds are looped. Zara is to be kept completely in the dark about my location. As far as she knows, I am at a conference in Tokyo. Do not let her call me. Do not let her track the jet. Handle her, Elias. He took a sip of the scotch, savoring the burn of the alcohol and the thrill of his own deception. He believed he was speaking to a servant, a man whose loyalty was bought with a paycheck. He believed that Zara was sitting at home, oblivious and budgeting for groceries, while he flew toward a future that didn't include her. He imagined the headlines next week. Architectural genius welcomes heir, and smiled at the perfection of his plan. But on the other end of the line, in the silent, mahogany-paneled library of the Vane estate, Elias did not lock the guest wing. He did not loop the security feeds. He held the receiver away from his ear, his expression cold and hard. He looked up at the woman standing across the desk from him. Zara wasn't in the dark. She was standing in the full light of the afternoon sun, her eyes dry and dangerous, listening to every word her husband said on speakerphone. And Elias, remembering exactly who had paid for his daughter's heart surgery when Dominic had refused, made the choice that would destroy the man on the plane. He looked at Zara, nodded once, and prepared to execute the order she had given him 10 minutes ago. Dominic hung up the phone and turned his attention back to the reason for his entire existence, the woman sleeping across the aisle. Lexi stirred, stretching under the cashmere blanket like a pampered cat. She was 24, with skin that hadn't yet seen a day of stress and hair that shone with the luster of expensive treatments. But her most important feature was the swell of her belly. A son. The ultrasound had confirmed it 4 months ago, and Dominic had nearly wept with relief. He was finally getting the heir to the Vane empire that Zara had failed to give him for 15 years. He looked at Lexi and felt a surge of justification. He wasn't a bad man, he told himself. He was simply a man with needs that had gone unmet. Zara was functional, yes. She kept the estate running, she managed the household staff, and she ensured his taxes were filed on time. But she was dry. She was a spreadsheet in a world where Dominic wanted art. She was constantly pestering him about liquidity ratios and overhead costs, nagging him about the price of the landscaping or the cost of the gala dinners. She had become boring, budget-obsessed, barren, dumb. Lexi murmured, blinking her eyes open. Are we there yet? My back is killing me. Soon, baby, Dominic soothed, leaning over to stroke her hair. 2 hours. Then we'll be at the penthouse. I've already ordered the nursery to be stocked with everything you need. And tomorrow, after we get you settled at the hospital, I'm going to buy you that necklace we saw in the catalog. Lexi smiled, that easy, greedy smile that Dominic mistook for adoration. You're the best. I can't believe we're finally doing this. Does she know? Dominic laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Zara? God no. She thinks I'm in Tokyo. She's probably sitting at the kitchen table right now, clipping coupons or arguing with the pool boy about the chlorine bill. She has no idea. And by the time she finds out, the IPO will be done, the divorce papers will be served, and I'll have custody of my son. She's the past, Lexi. You are the future. He pressed the call button for the flight attendant, intending to order another bottle of Dom Perignon to celebrate his genius. He felt untouchable. He felt like a god who had successfully rewritten his own destiny. He watched the flight attendant approach, tray in hand, and felt a swell of pride at how well he had orchestrated this transition. He had secured the bag, the baby, and the exit strategy. He had no idea that the credit card he had just used to pay for the in-flight Wi-Fi, the same card linked to the primary Vane household account, had just triggered a silent, digital alarm 3,000 miles away. He was toasting to his victory, completely unaware that he had just swiped himself into oblivion. 3,000 miles below the jet, the air in the Vane library was heavy with the scent of old paper and impending war. Elias stood motionless by the desk, the receiver still warm in his hand. For 10 years, he had served Dominic Vane. He had polished his shoes, ironed his newspapers, and poured his scotch. He had absorbed Dominic's insults, the snapped fingers, the ignored greetings, the way Dominic spoke about him in the third person while he was standing right there. Elias had swallowed his pride for the sake of the paycheck, for the sake of survival. But he had never swallowed his memory. He looked at Zara. She was standing by the window, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. She didn't look like a victim. She stood with her spine steel straight, her hands clasped behind her back. Elias remembered a rainy Tuesday 3 years ago. His daughter, Maya, had needed emergency surgery to correct a heart valve defect. The insurance had denied the claim. The cost was $40,000, money Elias didn't have. He had gone to Dominic, hat in hand, begging for a loan. Dominic had laughed, actually laughed, and told him, "If you can't afford children, Elias, perhaps you shouldn't have had them. It's poor financial planning." Dominic had dismissed him, but Zara had found him crying in the pantry an hour later. She hadn't said a word. She had simply written a personal check for $50,000, pressed it into his hand, and whispered, "Family is not a line item, Elias. Go save her." She had never asked for repayment. She had never mentioned it again. Dominic thought loyalty was bought. Zara knew it was earned. Elias made his decision. It wasn't a hard one. It was the easiest choice of his life. He walked around the heavy oak desk and opened the top drawer, where Dominic kept his emergency files. He pulled out a thick manila folder. The flight logs, the receipts from the jewelry stores, the paternity test results Dominic thought he had hidden. Elias had copied every single one of them. "He told me to lock you out, madam," Elias said, his voice steady. "He told me to treat you like a stranger in your own home." He extended the folder toward her. Zara turned. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning with a cold, terrifying intelligence. She took the folder. She didn't open it. She didn't need to see the proof to know it was true. "Thank you, Elias," she said softly. "You won't have to serve him ever again." "I know, madam. What are your instructions?" Zara looked at the folder, then at the phone, then at the sprawling estate around her. "He thinks he is the king of this castle, Elias. But he forgot who poured the foundation. Initiate the sovereign protocol. To understand the sheer magnitude of the violence Zara was about to inflict, you have to understand what she lost. You have to go back 12 years, to a cold, gray morning in Boston, inside a brownstone on Beacon Hill that smelled of cedar and history. That house wasn't just real estate. It was the physical embodiment of the sterling legacy. Zara's father had bought it with money earned from working double shifts at the shipyard, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. It was the house where Zara had learned to walk, where she had nursed her mother through cancer, where her father had died peacefully in his sleep. It was the only thing in the world that truly belonged to her. It was her anchor. 12 years ago, Dominic Vane wasn't a billionaire. He was a panic-stricken 26-year-old facing 10 years in federal prison for gross negligence and tax fraud on his first major construction project. He had cut corners, ignored safety regulations, and cooked the books. The FBI was circling. His assets were frozen. He was going to lose everything, and he was going to take Zara down with him. He had wept at her kitchen table, his head in his hands, begging her to save him. "I can fix it, Zara," he had sobbed. "I just need capital. I need to pay the fines and settle the lawsuits before the indictment drops. If you help me, I swear on my life, I will build you a palace. We are partners. 50-50. Forever." Zara was a forensic accountant. She knew the numbers didn't lie. She knew he was a risk. But she loved him. She believed in the potential she saw in his sketches. She believed that he was a good man who had made a mistake. So, she did the unthinkable. She put the brownstone on the market. Selling it felt like selling a limb. She remembered the day she handed over the keys. She walked through the empty rooms, touching the walls where her height had been marked in pencil, smelling the ghost of her father's pipe tobacco. She cried until she couldn't breathe. She sold her history, her memories, and her safety net for $2.5 million. She took that check, every single cent of it, and handed it to Dominic. She cleared his debts. She paid his fines. She hired the lawyers who kept him out of jail. She wiped his slate clean. "This is my father's life," she had told him, her voice shaking as she pressed the check into his palm. "Don't make me regret this." "I won't," Dominic had promised, his eyes shining with relief. "I will work every day to pay you back. You and me against the world, Zara. I promise." He had lied. He never paid her back. Not a dime. As soon as the danger passed and his new firm, Vane Skyline, began to soar, the loan became a contribution. Then it became our money. Then, as the years passed and his ego grew, he stopped acknowledging it altogether. He rewrote history. In his mind, he was a self-made genius who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps. Zara was just the lucky woman who got to ride in his passenger seat. He forgot the brownstone. He forgot the tears. He forgot that the very suit he wore on the cover of Forbes was bought with the money from her father's legacy. Back in the library, the memory of that empty brownstone hit Zara like a physical blow. The rage wasn't hot, it was absolute zero. He hadn't just cheated on her. He hadn't just replaced her. He had taken the ashes of her father's life and used them to buy a cashmere blanket for his mistress. She walked to the large oil painting of Dominic that hung over the fireplace, a portrait commissioned to make him look regal and imposing. She gripped the frame and swung it open. Behind the painting sat a heavy steel safe. Dominic had his own code for this safe, a code he changed monthly to keep Zara out. He kept his passport and his petty cash in there. But Zara didn't use Dominic's code. She punched in a sequence of numbers that Dominic didn't even know existed, the override code she had programmed into the system the day it was installed. Beep, 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 click. The heavy door swung open. Inside, sitting underneath Dominic's stack of cash, was a blue leather binder. It gathered no dust. Zara pulled it out. Her hands were steady. This wasn't just paperwork. This was the weapon she had forged 12 years ago, on the very day she handed him that check. Because even then, the forensic accountant in her knew a simple truth. Numbers don't lie, but men do. She opened the binder to the incorporation documents of Vane Skyline. She traced her finger over the signature line. Dominic thought he was the CEO. He thought he was the owner. But as Zara looked at the clause on page 42, she knew the truth. Dominic was merely an employee, and she was about to accept his resignation. Zara placed the blue binder on the desk and opened it with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an amputation. Inside lay the founding documents of Vane Skyline, papers that Dominic hadn't looked at since the day he scribbled his signature on the bottom line 12 years ago. He had been so eager to get his hands on the capital, so desperate to see his name in lights, that he had skipped the fine print. He had assumed, in his boundless arrogance, that Zara was simply his accountant, a woman organizing the boring details so he could focus on his genius. He was wrong. She wasn't his accountant. She was his landlord. Zara ran her finger down the text of the Articles of Incorporation. The language was dense, filled with legal jargon that would make an average person's eyes glaze over. But to Zara, it was poetry. It stated clearly, in black and white, that Vane Skyline was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Sovereign Trust. And the sole beneficiary of the Sovereign Trust was Zara Sterling Vane. But the real knife, the one Dominic had unknowingly held to his own throat for a decade, was on page 42. It was a clause Zara had inserted not out of malice, but out of prudence. The moral turpitude and fidelity clause. It stipulated that Dominic Vane was granted executive power of attorney to operate the firm and access its accounts only so long as he remained the lawful and faithful spouse of the beneficiary. It explicitly defined infidelity as a breach of contract that triggered an immediate, irrevocable termination of all executive powers. Dominic thought he was flying to New York to start a new life. In reality, by boarding that plane with his mistress, he had legally resigned. He never read it, did he? Elias asked quietly, looking at the document over her shoulder. He called it legal mumbo-jumbo, Zara replied, her voice devoid of humor. He told me, just point to where I signed, baby. He was too busy picking out the leather for his office chair to realize he didn't own the building. She picked up a red pen. It felt heavy in her hand, weighted with 12 years of silence, 12 years of being dismissed, 12 years of being the barren wife in the shadow of the visionary husband. She didn't hesitate. She didn't shake. She pressed the nib to the paper and signed the notice of executive termination. The ink bled into the page, dark, and permanent. Fax this to the board of directors, she ordered, handing the paper to Elias. And then send a digital copy to the bank. I want his status updated from CEO to unauthorized third party before his plane hits the tarmac. While Zara was legally decapitating her husband's career, the phone in the guest wing rang. Eleanor Vane, Dominic's mother, picked it up with a manicured hand. Eleanor was a woman who had spent her entire life failing upwards, carried first by her husband and then by her son. She lived in the estate's west wing, a sprawling suite of luxury that Zara paid for, eating food Zara bought, sleeping on linens Zara maintained. Yet, Eleanor looked at Zara with the same disdain one might look at a stain on a silk rug. "Dominic, darling." Eleanor cooed into the phone. "Are you in the air? How is she? How is the air?" "On the jet," Dominic laughed, the sound tinny through the receiver. "She's sleeping, mother. It's perfect. We're going to be in New York by dinner. I just needed to hear a friendly voice. I feel a little guilty about not telling Zara myself." "Oh, stop it," Eleanor snapped, sipping her afternoon sherry. "You have nothing to feel guilty about. That woman had 15 years to give you a family, and she gave you spreadsheets. A man of your stature needs a legacy, Dominic. You did what you had to do. Zara is just overhead. You're finally trimming the fat." Eleanor leaned back on the chaise lounge, gazing out at the manicured gardens she hadn't lifted a finger to cultivate. She despised Zara because Zara worked. She despised Zara because Zara came from new money earned through sweat, not inheritance. Eleanor had spent years whispering poison in Dominic's ear, encouraging the affair, helping him hide the receipts, telling him that he deserved better than a dried-up bean counter. "You're right, mother," Dominic said, his confidence restored. "As always. Listen, when the news breaks next week, things might get tense at the house. Just stay in your wing. I'll deal with Zara when I get back. Don't worry about me." Eleanor chuckled. "I'll simply lock my door and turn up the opera. Let her cry. It's the only thing she's good at." Eleanor hung up, feeling smug. She adjusted the thermostat, thinking the room was a degree too chilly. She didn't know that the chill wasn't coming from the air conditioning. It was coming from the reality that her free ride had just reached its final stop. She reached for the remote to turn on the television, but the screen remained black. She frowned and pressed the button again. Nothing. The lights above her flickered once, then died. The hum of the refrigerator in her kitchenette silenced. The air conditioning unit groaned and stopped. "Elias," she screamed into the sudden darkness. "Elias, the power is out." She didn't know that the power wasn't out. The main house was blazing with light. The breaker to the guest wing hadn't tripped, it had been pulled. And it wasn't going to be turned back on. In the main house, the atmosphere was surgical. Zara and Elias moved through the master suite like a hazmat team clearing a contaminated site. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The rhythm of their work was fueled by a shared, silent fury. Zara pulled a roll of heavy-duty black contractor bags from the utility closet. She snapped one open with a sharp crack that echoed off the marble walls. She walked to Dominic's closet, a walk-in cedar room larger than the apartment she had lived in when they first met. It was filled with Italian wool suits, bespoke shirts, and handmade leather shoes. Thousands of dollars of fabric, all bought with company funds, all hanging perfectly spaced. She didn't carefully fold them. She didn't pack them in suitcases. She grabbed armfuls of silk and wool, hangers and all, and shoved them into the garbage bags. Crunch, rustle, thud. Elias worked on the drawers. He dumped Dominic's collection of luxury watches, most of them gifts from vendors that Zara knew were technically bribes, into a plastic grocery sack. He cleared the bathroom counter, sweeping expensive colognes and grooming kits into the trash with a sweep of his arm. There was no reverence for the objects Dominic prized. Treated like this, stripped of their display cases and lighting, they looked like what they were, just things. Expensive junk accumulated by a hollow man. "The guest room is cleared, madam," Elias said, tying off a bag filled with Dominic's golf trophies. "Shall I move these to the curb?" "No," Zara said, shoving a $3,000 tuxedo into a bag filled with dirty gym socks. "Put them in the driveway, outside the gate. Let him see them before he even gets inside. I want him to understand that his eviction isn't a negotiation. It's a disposal." They worked until the room was stripped bare. The closet was empty. The drawers were hollow. The only thing left in the room was the smell of his cologne, lingering in the air like a bad memory. Zara paused by the fireplace mantel. There, in a silver frame, was their wedding photo. 15 years ago. They looked so young. Dominic looked at her with adoration in that photo, or at least, the performance of adoration. Zara looked at him with absolute trust. She looked at the woman in the photo and pitied her. She hated her naivety, but she honored her survival. She picked up the frame. For a moment, Elias thought she might cry. He thought she might keep it as a memento of the love that used to be. Instead, Zara walked over to the pile of black garbage bags. She didn't smash the glass. She didn't throw it. She simply dropped it into the bag labeled evidence, right on top of the paternity test Elias had stolen from Dominic's desk. Seal it, she said, turning her back on the empty room. We have a board meeting to attend. Zara sat at the mahogany desk in Dominic's home office, a space he had forbidden her from entering, while Genius was at work. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and ego. She woke up his computer, bypassing the password protection with a keystroke logger she had installed 6 months ago when her suspicions first began. The screen glowed to life, revealing a desktop background of Dominic shaking hands with the mayor, a photo where he had cropped Zara out of the frame. She opened the secure banking portal for the Vane Skyline operational accounts. The numbers on the screen were staggering. $18 million in liquid operating capital, $12 million in the Cayman holding account, another $4 million in the joint personal savings. To Dominic, these numbers represented power. To Zara, they represented leverage. She didn't steal a penny. She simply reorganized. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, executing a series of pre-authorized SWIFT transfers. Because the accounts were technically owned by the sovereign trust, Zara had full administrative rights to reallocate funds for asset protection. She initiated a liquidity freeze on the subsidiary accounts, the ones linked to Dominic's black card and the company expense accounts. She moved the bulk of the capital into a secured escrow account titled the Phoenix Reserve, accessible only by her biometric scan. The progress bars crawled across the screen. Transferring. It was a bloodless coup. There were no guns, no screaming, just the quiet click of a mouse dismantling a man's entire financial existence. She watched the balance in Dominic's primary checking account drop from 7 figures to 0. She watched the available credit on his American Express Centurion card switch from unlimited to suspended. She wasn't just cutting him off. She was unmaking him. In the modern world, a man without access to capital is a ghost. She was turning the billionaire architect into a specter before he even touched the ground. Transfer complete. The screen flashed green. Zara leaned back. Exhaling a breath she felt she had been holding for 15 years. At that exact moment, the digital nervous system of the banking world sent a kill signal to every piece of plastic in Dominic's wallet. The trap was set. Now, she just had to wait for him to step into it. 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, Dominic decided that Lexi deserved a treat. He had been flipping through the high-end duty-free catalog provided by the private charter service, and a diamond tennis bracelet had caught his eye. It was gaudy, overpriced, and sparkling. Exactly the kind of thing that shut Lexi up when she started complaining about her back pain. He pressed the call button. The flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah who had been forced to listen to Dominic brag about his stock options for 3 hours, appeared with a forced smile. "I'll take this," Dominic said, stabbing his finger at the page. "Wrap it. I want to give it to her before we land." "Of course, Mr. Vane. An excellent choice. That will be $12,000. Dominic pulled out his sleek, black titanium Centurion card, the heavy metal card that made a satisfying thud when dropped on a table. It was his talisman. It was the key to the world. He handed it to her without looking up, already imagining Lexi's squeal of delight. Sarah walked to the galley and swiped the card through the mobile terminal. She frowned. She swiped it again. She blew on the chip and inserted it. A red light flashed. Transaction denied. Issuer referral. She walked back to Dominic's seat, her steps hesitant. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Vane. The card was declined." Dominic laughed. It was a loud, incredulous sound that woke Lexi up. "Declined? Don't be ridiculous. That card has no limit. Your machine is broken. Try it again." "I did, sir. Twice. It says issuer referral. Do you have another card?" Irritated now, Dominic reached into his wallet and pulled out his platinum visa. "Use this one." And tell the pilot to check the Wi-Fi connection. Obviously, your system is offline. Sarah returned to the galley. She swiped the visa. Red light. Declined. She felt a pit in her stomach. It was awkward enough dealing with rude passengers. Dealing with broke, rude passengers was a nightmare. She returned to the seat. I'm afraid this one is declined as well, sir. The cabin went silent. The hum of the engines seemed to drop a pitch. Dominic's face turned a mottled shade of red. That is impossible, he hissed, snatching the card back. I have millions of dollars in those accounts. Call your supervisor. I am the supervisor on this flight, Mr. Vane. Perhaps you should call your bank. Dominic sat frozen. For the first time in a decade, the magic plastic didn't work. He felt a cold prickle of sweat on his forehead. He looked at Lexi, who was watching him with wide, confused eyes. It's a glitch, he muttered, shoving the wallet back into his pocket. Just a bank security glitch because I'm traveling. I'll fire my banker when we land. Forget the bracelet. He waved the flight attendant away, trying to regain his composure. But as he turned to look out the window at the dark ocean below, his heart hammered against his ribs. A glitch happened to one card. It didn't happen to two. For the first time since he boarded the plane, the king of the skyline felt a tremor in his foundation. Back at the estate, Zara wasn't celebrating. She was checking the calendar. The digital clock on the wall read 48 hours. 48 hours. That was exactly how long until Vane Skyline was scheduled to ring the opening bell on the New York Stock Exchange. The IPO was the endgame. If the company went public with Dominic listed as the CEO and the primary face of the brand, the board would lock in his shares. He would be vested. Even if she fired him afterward, he would walk away with hundreds of millions in stock options. He would win. She couldn't let him ring that bell. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she had only used twice. It was the direct private line of Arthur Sterling, no relation, but a man who respected the name, the chairman of the board for Vane Skyline. Arthur was an old-school shark. He cared about two things, profit and stability. He tolerated Dominic's arrogance because Dominic sold condos. He would not tolerate a scandal. This is Sterling, the voice barked. Arthur, it's Zara Vane. There was a pause. Arthur usually spoke to Dominic. Zara was the invisible wife. Zara? Is everything all right? Is Dominic okay? Dominic is currently in the air, flying to New York with his mistress to birth an illegitimate child, Zara said. She didn't use a trembling voice. She used the voice of a forensic auditor presenting a fraud case. He has vacated his post 48 hours before the IPO. He has utilized company funds to facilitate this affair, which is a violation of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act regarding executive misuse of assets. The silence on the other end was heavy. Arthur was listening. I am invoking the morality clause of the sovereign trust, Zara continued, staring at the clock as the seconds ticked down. I have the receipts, Arthur. I have the flight logs, the jewelry purchases, and the hospital admission forms. If Dominic rings that bell on Friday, I will release this file to the SEC and the Wall Street Journal simultaneously. The stock will tank before the first trade is made. You will lose billions. What do you want, Zara? Arthur asked, his voice low and dangerous. I want the bell, she said. I want him removed from the prospectus immediately. I am stepping in as interim CEO, effective tonight. You can announce it as a health emergency for Dominic, or we can announce it as a sex scandal. The choice is yours, Arthur. But Dominic Vane does not step foot on that trading floor. Send me the file, Arthur said. And Zara? If you're bluffing, I'll bury you. Check your inbox, Arthur. The file is already there. She hung up. The clock read 47 hours, 58 minutes, and 12 seconds. The bomb was armed. Now, she just had to wait for Dominic to land and realize he had been blown up in midair. The Gulfstream touched down at Teterboro Airport under a blanket of gray, miserable drizzle. Dominic stood up before the seatbelt sign flickered off, eager to escape the confined space and step into the kingdom of New York City. He adjusted his suit jacket, checked his reflection in the bulkhead monitor to ensure his CEO face was in place, and helped the groggy Lexi to her feet. She was complaining about her ankles again, whining about the cabin pressure, but Dominic tuned her out. He was focused on the arrival. He expected the usual choreography, the black Lincoln Navigator waiting on the tarmac, the driver holding an umbrella, the seamless transition from luxury jet to luxury car. But when the cabin door opened and the stairs descended, there was no Lincoln. There was no driver. There was only rain and empty asphalt. Dominic stepped out, shielding his eyes against the wind. He looked around, bewildered. He paid a retainer of $10,000 a month to a premier concierge service specifically to ensure he never had to wait for a car. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hammering the speed dial for the dispatch line. "Where is my car?" he barked the moment the line connected. "I am standing in the rain at Teterboro. You were supposed to be wheels down at 6. "One moment, Mr. Vane," the dispatcher said. Her voice wasn't apologetic, it was confused. There was the sound of typing. "Sir, our system shows that your account was suspended 45 minutes ago." "Suspended?" Dominic laughed, a sound that was starting to carry a ragged edge of panic. "I didn't suspend anything. I am the client. Send the car immediately." "I cannot do that, sir." The suspension came from the primary account holder. The note on the file says unauthorized user. "We have been instructed to terminate all services effectively immediately. We cannot send a vehicle. I am the primary account holder." Dominic screamed, ignoring the flight crew who were watching him with pity from the dry safety of the plane. "My name is on the building. My name is on the bill." "Actually, sir," the dispatcher corrected, her voice turning cold. "The account is in the name of the sovereign trust, and the trustee has revoked your privileges. Have a nice evening." The line went dead. Dominic stared at the phone, water dripping from his nose onto the screen. Lexi was standing at the bottom of the stairs, shivering in her thin cashmere wrap, clutching her designer bag. "Dom, where's the driver?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's freezing. My feet hurt." Dominic looked at her. For the first time, he didn't see a trophy. He saw a liability. He saw a problem he couldn't solve with a swipe of a card. He looked at the empty tarmac, the gray sky, and the distant terminal building that was a mile walk away. "We have to call a cab," he muttered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "A cab?" Lexi shrieked. "You said we were taking a limo. I can't walk to the terminal, Dom. I'm pregnant." "Then start walking," he snapped, his facade cracking. He grabbed his carry-on bag and started trudging across the wet asphalt, the rain soaking through his $3,000 Italian suit. He looked like a drowned rat in a bespoke suit, marching toward a terminal where he would have to stand in line with the general public, waiting for a yellow taxi that smelled of stale smoke. The king had arrived in New York, but his carriage had turned into a pumpkin before he even left the airport. The taxi ride was a 40-minute descent into misery. The driver drove with a lead foot, jerking the car through the stop-and-go traffic of the Lincoln Tunnel, while the back seat smelled faintly of old fast food and pine air freshener. Lexi spent the entire ride crying softly, ruining her makeup, asking Dominic over and over what was happening. Dominic stayed silent, staring out the window at the Manhattan skyline, a skyline he used to believe he owned, but which now looked like a fortress built to keep him out. They finally pulled up to the Plaza Hotel. This was Dominic's sanctuary. He had stayed in the royal suite so many times the staff knew his Scotch order by heart. He needed this. He needed the marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the obsequious staff bowing and scraping. He needed to feel powerful again to shake off the humiliation of the airport. He marched into the lobby, leaving Lexi to struggle with the bags, and approached the reception desk with his chest puffed out. He slammed his hand on the marble counter. "Dominic Vane," he announced, loud enough for the tourists in the lobby to turn and look. "I have a reservation for the Grand Suite. And have someone fetch my bags from the curb. My wife is tired." The receptionist, a man with impeccable posture and a face of stone, didn't type anything. He didn't smile. He simply folded his hands on the desk and looked at Dominic with a polite, professional pity. "Mr. Vane," the receptionist said quietly, "we were expecting you." "Good. Then give me the key." "I'm afraid I cannot do that, sir. Your reservation was canceled 2 hours ago." "Canceled?" Dominic's voice rose to a shout. "By who?" "By the booking agent, sir. The Sovereign Trust. Additionally, we received a notification regarding your payment method." The receptionist lowered his voice to a whisper, leaning in slightly. "We were informed that you are currently a credit risk. The hotel has been instructed to decline any bookings under your name unless paid in cash, up front, including a $10,000 security deposit." Dominic felt the blood drain from his face. The lobby, with its scent of fresh lilies and old money, suddenly felt suffocating. He could feel the eyes of the other guests on him, wealthy men in suits, women in pearls, watching the scene unfold. They recognized the smell of desperation. "This is a mistake," Dominic hissed, leaning over the counter. "I am Dominic Vane. I designed half the buildings in this city. You will give me my room, or I will buy this hotel and fire you." "Sir, please lower your voice," the receptionist said, signaling to a large security guard standing by the elevators. "If you cannot provide a valid form of payment, I must ask you to leave. You are disturbing the guests." Lexi had walked up behind him, breathless and wet from the rain. "Dom, what's going on? Why aren't we going up?" Dominic looked at her. Then he looked at the security guard taking a step toward them. He looked at the receptionist's unyielding face. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had no money. He had no credit. He had no power. "We're leaving," Dominic choked out. "Leaving?" Lexi cried, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "To go where?" "Dom, I need to lie down." "I said we're leaving." Dominic grabbed her arm, roughly pulling her away from the desk. He dragged his pregnant mistress out of the golden marble lobby, past the judging eyes of the elite, and back out into the cold, wet New York night. They stood on the sidewalk, humiliated and homeless. Dominic pulled out his phone and searched for cheap motels Queens. The only room he could afford with the $200 of cash in his wallet was a roadside inn near the airport, a place with neon signs and hourly rates. Atmosphere in the Vane Estate Library was hushed and lethal. Zara sat at the head of the long conference table, her laptop open, the camera capturing her against a backdrop of leather-bound books. She wore a black blazer, sharp and severe. She didn't look like a scorned wife. She looked like a CEO. On the screen, the grid of faces representing the board of directors looked back at her. Chairman Arthur sat in the center square, his face grim. "Thank you for convening on such short notice," Zara began. Her voice was steady, projecting absolute competence. "As you know, we are 48 hours from the IPO. Stability is paramount. However, we have a liability that must be excised." "Zara," Arthur said, leaning into his camera, "you sent us a file labeled forensic audit. That's a heavy term." "It's an accurate term," Zara replied. She clicked a button, sharing her screen. A spreadsheet appeared. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. Zara highlighted rows in red. "These are unauthorized withdrawals from the company operational accounts over the last 9 months. Line item 402, client acquisition dinner, $12,000. The receipt shows a table for 2 at Le Bernardin. The guest was not a client. It was Miss Lexi Miller, a 24-year-old intern." She clicked to the next slide. Line item 510, office supplies, $80,000. The invoice is from Cartier. "Unless we are decorating the office with diamonds, this is embezzlement." The board members murmured. Misuse of funds was bad, but embezzlement was criminal. "Dominic Vane has treated this public company as his personal piggy bank," Zara continued, her voice hardening. "But that is not the worst of it. The worst is the liability." She pulled up the hospital admission form from New York Presbyterian. "Dominic is currently in New York to father an illegitimate child with said intern. If he rings the bell on Friday, the press will find out on Saturday. The stock will plummet. The SEC will investigate. We will be sued by every shareholder for failing to disclose a material risk." She paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the digital air. She looked directly into the camera lens. "I own the controlling interest through the sovereign trust. I have the power to remove him, but I want the board's backing. I want a unanimous vote of no confidence. We cut him out tonight. We scrub his name from the prospectus tomorrow. I step in as interim CEO to steady the ship." Arthur rubbed his temples. He looked at the undeniable numbers. He looked at the scandal waiting to explode. He was a businessman, and Dominic had just become a bad investment. All in favor of the motion to terminate Dominic Vane for cause and appoint Zara Vane as interim CEO? Arthur asked. One by one, the hands went up. Every single square. "It's unanimous," Arthur said. "He's out. Do you want to tell him, Zara?" "No," Zara said, closing the laptop. "Let him find out when his key card doesn't work at the office. I have other work to do." She sat back in the silent library. It was done. She had just fired her husband from the company he thought he built, and he was currently sleeping on a polyester bedspread in Queens, completely unaware that he was no longer an architect. He was just a man with a lot of debt and a pregnant mistress who was realizing she had made a terrible mistake. While Dominic was breathing in the scent of stale cigarettes in a Queens motel, his mother, Eleanor, was about to experience her own localized darkness. In the west wing of the Vane estate, Eleanor was reclined on a velvet chaise, watching a reality show about housewives who were far less wealthy than she pretended to be. She reached for a crystal bowl of pistachios, imported, of course, on Zara's dime, and felt a smug sense of satisfaction. Her son had finally upgraded. The new girl, Lexi, was young and malleable. Eleanor would mold her. She would ensure that this time, she remained the matriarch of the house, unlike with Zara, who had always looked at Eleanor with those unsettling, knowing eyes. Suddenly, the 60-inch television blinked off. The crystal chandelier overhead flickered once, buzzed like an angry hornet, and died. The gentle hum of the central air conditioning, which kept the room at a crisp 68 degrees, wheezed into silence. Eleanor sat up, blinking in the sudden gloom. "Elias," she shouted, her voice shrill. "The breakers have tripped again. Fix it immediately." She waited for the sound of rushing footsteps, for the apology, for the restoration of her comfort. Instead, she heard only the heavy, deliberate tread of polished shoes on the hardwood floor. The door to her suite opened, not with a knock, but with the turn of a key. Elias stood there holding a flashlight. He wasn't wearing his usual service jacket. He was wearing a trench coat and holding a manila envelope. "The power is out, Elias," Eleanor snapped, clutching her robe. "Why are you standing there? Go to the basement." "The power is not out, madam," Elias said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "The main house is fully operational. The west wing, however, has been disconnected from the grid." "Disconnected? By whom?" "By the owner of the property." Elias walked forward and placed the envelope on the side table. "This is an eviction notice, effective immediately. Mrs. Zara Vane has instructed me to inform you that the family guest privileges have been revoked due to a violation of the residency agreement. Specifically, the clause regarding conspiracy to undermine the marital union." Eleanor laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "You can't evict me. My son owns this house. Dominic will have your job for this." "Dominic owns nothing," Elias corrected gently, as if explaining physics to a toddler. "The estate is the property of the Sovereign Trust. You have been a guest of Zara Vane for 12 years, and she is tired of hosting someone who despises her." He shone the flashlight toward the door. "Your bags have been packed and placed on the curb. A car service has been called to take you to the Motel 6 in town. I suggest you hurry. It's beginning to rain." Eleanor scrambled for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Dominic's number. "I'm calling him. I'm calling him right now. He will fix this." Elias watched her dial, his face impassive. "Please do, madam." He could probably use a familiar voice. "I believe he is currently experiencing a similar accommodation issue in New York." Eleanor listened to the phone ring and ring, finally going to voicemail. She looked at Elias, then at the darkroom, then at the envelope. For the first time, the reality of her position crashed down on her. She wasn't the queen mother. She was a squatter, and the landlord had just cut the lights. Sunlight filtered through the thin, yellowed curtains of the motel room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Lexi woke up to the sound of a truck backfiring on the highway outside and the rhythmic, congested snoring of the man beside her. She blinked, confused by the scratchy texture of the polyester blanket against her cheek. This wasn't the 1,000-thread count Egyptian cotton she had been promised. This wasn't the penthouse view of Central Park. She sat up, her back aching from the lumpy mattress. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and despair. Beside her, Dominic Vane, the billionaire, the visionary, the man she had banked her entire future on, was drooling slightly onto a flat pillow. He looked gray. He looked old. Without the expensive suit and the flattering lighting of private jets, he looked like exactly what he was, a middle-aged man in a cheap motel. Lexi grabbed her phone from the nightstand, desperate for a distraction. She needed to see the world she belonged in, the world of Instagram likes and envy. She opened her feed, expecting to see photos of her friends at brunch. Instead, the first post on her timeline was a news alert from Business Insider. Breaking: leadership shakeup at Vane Skyline ahead of IPO. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She clicked the link. The photo wasn't of Dominic. It was of Zara. She looked powerful, standing at a podium, flanked by the board of directors. Lexi's eyes scanned the text, her breath catching in her throat. "Board votes unanimously to remove Dominic Vane as CEO, citing financial irregularities. Zara Vane named interim CEO. Sources confirm the company is a subsidiary of the Sovereign Trust. Lexi read the words again. Subsidiary. Removed. Financial irregularities. She looked at the diamond bracelet on her wrist, the one Dominic had given her last month. She looked at the man sleeping beside her. The math hit her with the force of a physical slap. If Zara owned the company and Dominic was fired and his credit cards were declined, he wasn't a billionaire. He was a fraud. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She had burned bridges for this. She had quit her internship, alienated her friends, and mocked Zara to anyone who would listen. She had bet everything on the king of the skyline. And now she was pregnant, stranded in Queens, with a man who couldn't even afford a hotel room. Dom, she screamed, shoving his shoulder. Wake up. Dominic snorted and jerked awake, looking around wildly. What? What is it? Is it the car? It's not the car, you idiot. It's you. She shoved the phone into his face. Look at this. Zara is the CEO? You're fired? Tell me this is fake news, Dominic. Tell me you didn't drag me to a motel in Queens while your wife steals your company. Dominic grabbed the phone, squinting at the bright screen. As he read the headline, the color drained from his face, leaving him pale and sickly. He didn't shout. He didn't deny it. He just stared at the picture of his wife, realizing that while he was sleeping, she had locked the gates to the kingdom. Dominic spent the morning pacing the small motel room, making frantic calls that went straight to voicemail. His banker, his lawyer, his mother. No one answered. It was as if he had been erased from the network. But there was one problem he couldn't ignore: Lexi's scheduled prenatal checkup. We have to go, he told her, trying to summon the remnants of his authority. The appointment is at New York Presbyterian. It's the best hospital in the city. Once we get there, I'll sort this out. It's just a misunderstanding. I'll bill it to the firm. They took an Uber to the hospital. Lexi refused to walk to the subway. When they walked into the marble-floored atrium of the private maternity wing, Dominic straightened his wrinkled suit jacket. He walked up to the reception desk with the swagger of a man who was used to owning the room. Dominic Vane, he announced to the head administrator, a stern woman with glasses on a chain. We are here for Ms. Miller's admission. Private suite, Ocean View. The administrator didn't look up from her computer. She typed for a moment, the clicking of the keys the only sound in the tense air. Then she stopped. Mr. Vane, she said, looking over her glasses. I see your appointment here. However, there is a flag on the file. What flag? Insurance coverage terminated. Effective yesterday at midnight. Dominic felt the eyes of the lobby on him. Other couples, wealthy, happy, secure, were watching. That's ridiculous. It's a corporate policy. Rerun it. I have run it 3 times, sir. The policyholder, Vane Skyline, has removed you and any dependents from the plan. We cannot admit Ms. Miller without a valid insurance card or a deposit. A deposit? Dominic scoffed, trying to laugh it off. Fine. I'll write a check. How much? For a high-risk delivery in a private suite? The administrator looked him up and down, noting the wrinkled suit and the sweat on his brow. The deposit is $50,000. Cash or certified check only. $50,000. It was the exact amount Zara had given Elias for his daughter's surgery. It was pocket change to the man Dominic used to be. But to the man he was today, it was an impossible sum. I don't have that on me, Dominic stammered. Can't you bill me? You know who I am. I'm Dominic Vane. I know who you are, sir, the administrator said coldly. You are the man currently trending on Twitter for being fired by his wife. And this is a private hospital, not a charity. If you cannot pay, you will have to go to the public hospital downtown. Downtown, Lexi shrieked, her voice cracking with humiliation. I am not having my baby in a public ward, Dominic. You promised me the penthouse suite. You promised me everything. Lower your voice, Dominic hissed, grabbing her arm. People are staring. Let them stare. Lexi pulled away, tears streaming down her face. They already know. Everyone knows. You're broke, Dominic. You're a joke. She stormed out of the lobby, her sobbing echoing off the high ceilings. Dominic stood alone at the desk, stripped of his armor, stripped of his pride. The administrator looked at him with zero sympathy and pointed to the door. Please leave, Mr. Vane. You are blocking the line for paying customers. Dominic stood on the sidewalk outside the hospital, the rain plastering his hair to his skull. Lexi was sitting on a bench a few feet away, sobbing into her hands, refusing to look at him. Passers-by gave them a wide berth. They looked like a tragedy unfolding in real time. Dominic's hand shook as he pulled his phone from his pocket. He stared at the screen. He had no choice. He had no money, no insurance, and no plan. He had to call the only person capable of fixing this mess, even if she was the one who had caused it. He dialed home. The ringback tone sounded for what felt like an eternity. Ring, ring, ring. He prayed she would answer. He rehearsed the lie in his head. Zara, baby, I lost my wallet. I'm stuck at the airport. Send a wire. It was weak, but it was all he had. Hello. Her voice was calm, unsettlingly calm. In the background, he could hear the faint clink of silverware on china. She was eating dinner. The normalcy of it made his stomach churn. Zara. Dominic breathed, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. Thank God you picked up. Listen, something terrible has happened. I was mugged. In Tokyo. They took my wallet, my cards, everything. The bank put a freeze on the accounts for security. I'm stuck at the consulate. I need you to wire $50,000 to the emergency account immediately. He waited. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying she would buy it. Praying she was still the naive wife who believed his stories. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her chewing. Then, the sound of a sip of wine. Tokyo? Zara asked softly. That's strange. Because the caller ID says you're in Manhattan. Specifically the Upper East Side. Dominic froze. The blood drained from his face. No, that's a routing error. The consulate lines are weird. Zara, please, I don't have time to argue. I need the money. You don't need money, Dominic, Zara said, her voice dropping to a register that was pure ice. You need a reality check. You aren't at the consulate. You are outside New York Presbyterian, where you just tried to admit your mistress using a company insurance policy that I canceled yesterday. Dominic opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The lie disintegrated in his throat. She knew. She knew everything. Zara, wait. I hope the baby is healthy, Dominic, she interrupted. Truly. Because that child is going to need a strong constitution to grow up with a father who is currently unemployed, homeless, and under investigation for embezzlement. Embezzlement? Zara, you can't. I already did. The board voted an hour ago. You're out. The locks have been changed. Your mother has been evicted. And Dominic? Don't bother coming home. There's nothing there for you anymore. You can't do this. Dominic screamed into the phone, losing all control. I built that life. I am Dominic Vane. You were Dominic Vane, she corrected. Now? You're just a line item I decided to cut. The line went dead. Dominic stared at the phone, the silence ringing in his ears louder than the city traffic. He looked at Lexi, who had stopped crying and was watching him with wide, horrified eyes. She had heard him scream. She knew the lie was over. The safety net was gone. They were free-falling. Getting back to Los Angeles required a humiliation Dominic had never experienced in his adult life. The pawn shop. He had walked into a dusty shop in Queens, a place with bars on the windows and a smell of desperation. He had unclasped his Patek Philippe watch, a $40,000 timepiece he had bought to celebrate his first million. The broker, a man with grease under his fingernails, had looked at it with bored eyes. $5,000, the man grunted. It's worth 40, Dominic argued, his voice cracking. $5,000. Take it or leave it. Dominic took it. It was just enough to buy 2 last-minute, one-way tickets to LAX. Economy class. Row 38. The seats by the toilets. Boarding the plane felt like walking to the gallows. Dominic was used to turning left upon entering an aircraft, used to the wide leather armchairs and the champagne service. Turning right was a descent into a different world. The aisle was narrow. The air was thick with the smell of humanity, sweat, fast food, and stale coffee. He bumped shoulders with tired travelers who didn't know his name and didn't care. He squeezed into seat 38B. The seat was cramped, his knees pressing painfully into the plastic tray table in front of him. Lexi took the window seat, refusing to look at him, curling herself into a ball of misery against the fuselage. As the plane took off, a baby in the row behind them started to scream. It was a piercing, relentless shriek that drilled into Dominic's skull. He reached for his noise-canceling headphones, then realized he had left them in his carry-on, which was currently jammed into an overhead bin 10 rows up because there was no space above them. He closed his eyes, trying to dissociate. But he couldn't escape the sensory overload. The man next to him in the aisle seat opened a tuna sandwich, the pungent smell wafting over Dominic. The air conditioning vent above him was broken, blowing a weak stream of warm air onto his sweating face. The flight attendant, harried and exhausted, didn't offer him scotch. She tossed a bag of pretzels onto his tray table without making eye contact. Pretzels. Dominic looked at the small, crinkly silver bag. 12 hours ago, he was drinking Dom Perignon. Now he was eating pretzels in a middle seat while a stranger's elbow dug into his ribs. He looked at Lexi. She was staring out the window at the dark clouds, tears silently tracking down her cheeks. She wasn't holding his hand. She wasn't looking at him with adoration anymore. The spell was broken. The billionaire lifestyle she had signed up for had evaporated, leaving only the cramped, uncomfortable reality of a man who had lied about who he was. Dominic leaned his head back against the thin, greasy headrest. A tear leaked from his own eye, not for Zara, not for his marriage, but for himself, for the comfort he had lost, for the legroom he would never get back. He realized, with a terrifying clarity, that this middle seat was not temporary. This was his new life. While Dominic was suffering through the purgatory of economy class, Zara was executing the final phase of her extraction plan. It was 2 a.m. in Los Angeles. The Vane Skyline headquarters, a glass monolith in downtown, was silent and dark. Zara swiped her keycard at the executive entrance. The light turned green. She walked through the lobby, her heels clicking on the polished concrete floors. The night security guard, a man named Marcus whom Dominic had threatened to fire twice for smiling too much, stood up straight. "Good evening, Mrs. Vane," Marcus said respectfully. "I was told to expect you." "Thank you, Marcus. I won't be long." She took the private elevator to the top floor. The doors slid open to reveal the sanctuary Dominic had built for himself. The office was a monument to his ego. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. A desk made of imported Italian marble. A chair that cost more than a Honda Civic. Zara walked in and turned on the lights. She didn't feel sentimental. She felt efficient. She walked to the wall where the Vane art collection hung. Modern masterpieces that Dominic claimed to love but secretly didn't understand. He had bought them with company money, claiming they were investments. Zara took them down, one by one. She wasn't stealing them. She was repossessing collateral. She leaned the canvases against the wall, tagging them with yellow stickers that read, "Property of the Sovereign Trust." She moved to the safe concealed in the credenza. She opened it. Inside were the original blueprints for the Skyline Spire, the design that had put Dominic on the map. Except Dominic hadn't drawn them. A brilliant young architect named Sarah had drawn them, and Dominic had bullied her into signing over the rights for a pittance. Zara took the tubes. She would find Sarah. She would make it right. Finally, she stood before the massive marble desk. It was cluttered with Dominic's awards, his crystal paperweights, his framed magazine covers. Zara swept them all into a cardboard box. She left the desk completely bare, a cold slab of stone stripped of its false idols. She reached into her purse and pulled out a single piece of paper. It was yellowed with age, the ink fading but still legible. It was the bank receipt from 12 years ago. Wire transfer, $2,500,000. Source, estate of Thomas Sterling. Beneficiary, Dominic Vane Legal Defense Fund. She placed the receipt in the exact center of the empty desk. She grabbed a roll of Scotch tape and taped it to the marble. It was a tombstone. When Dominic eventually came here, and she knew he would try, he wouldn't find his chair. He wouldn't find his awards. He would find the price tag of his life. He would find the proof that he had never been a self-made man. He had been a scholarship student in the school of Zara Sterling, and he had just been expelled. She turned off the lights, leaving the receipt glowing in the moonlight, and walked out of the office for the last time. The king was dead. Long live the queen. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Dominic turned on his phone, desperate for a lifeline. He expected to see frantic texts from his lawyer or apologies from his banker. Instead, his notifications were a solid wall of digital noise. His Twitter mentions had exploded. His Instagram was being flooded with snake emojis. He had gone viral, but not for his architecture. A video had been uploaded to TikTok 2 hours ago by a nurse in the waiting room of New York Presbyterian. The caption read, "Billionaire CEO, tries to bully hospital staff when his card declines. Hashtag eat the rich, hashtag karma. Dominic clicked play with shaking hands. The video was grainy, but the audio was crystal clear. It showed him, sweaty and disheveled in his wrinkled suit, screaming at the administrator, "Do you know who I am? I am Dominic Vane." It showed Lexi crying in the background, looking terrified. It showed the security guard escorting him out like a common drunk. The view count was climbing by the second, 3.4 million views. He scrolled to the comments. They were brutal. Imagine bragging about being rich and getting declined for a $50 copay. Is that his mistress? Yikes. Vane Skyline IPO is going to be a disaster, LOL. Dominic felt bile rise in his throat. This wasn't just embarrassment. This was financial homicide. He checked the pre-market trading data for Vane Skyline. The IPO was still 40 hours away, but the gray market sentiment, the indicator of investor interest, had cratered. The analysts were already dissecting the footage. A leading financial blog had posted an article titled, "The Emperor Has No Clothes. Vane CEO Meltdown Raises Liquidity Concerns." He looked over at Lexi. She had seen it too. She was staring at her phone, her face illuminated by the pale blue light, reading the comments about herself. Homewrecker, gold digger, she looks cheap. She wasn't crying anymore. She looked numb. She looked like someone waking up from a dream to find the house on fire. The plane's wheels hit the tarmac with a violent thud, jostling them in their cramped seats. To Dominic, it felt like the final nail being hammered into his coffin. He had left Los Angeles as a visionary. He was returning as a meme. And the woman who held the remote control to his destruction was waiting for him in the hills, probably watching the view count rise with a glass of wine in her hand. The taxi ride from LAX to the Vane estate was a funeral procession of silence. They had no luggage. It had been lost by the airline somewhere in Chicago, so they sat in the back of the Prius with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Lexi stared out the window at the passing palm trees, her arms crossed protectively over her stomach. Dominic stared at the meter, watching the dollars tick up, calculating if the cash from the pawned watch would cover the fare. They wound up the canyon roads, the city lights fading behind them. Finally, the massive wrought iron gates of the estate came into view. To Dominic, they had always looked majestic, a symbol of his exclusion from the common world. Now, they looked like the bars of a cell. "Stop here," Dominic ordered the driver. He got out, leaving Lexi in the car. He walked to the keypad mounted on the stone pillar. He punched in the code, 1-9-8-5. It was his birth year. He had used it for a decade. Beep, beep, beep. Access denied. A red light flashed. Dominic frowned. He must have mistyped it. His hands were shaking from exhaustion and hunger. He punched it in again, slower this time. Beep, beep, beep. Access denied. "Come on," he muttered, slamming his palm against the metal box. "Open, damn you." He tried the backup code, then the service code, then the emergency override. Nothing. The gates stood immovable, 12 feet of steel separating him from his bed, his shower, and his life. He could see the house in the distance, glowing warmly on the hill. It looked so inviting, so normal, but he was stuck on the outside, a ghost haunting his own property. He grabbed the bars of the gate and shook them, rattling the metal. "Elias," he screamed into the darkness. "Elias, open the damn gate. I know you're in there." For a long moment, there was only the sound of crickets and the idling taxi engine. Then, a light flickered on at the gatehouse. A figure emerged from the shadows, walking slowly down the long driveway. It was Elias. He was wearing his immaculate uniform, his posture perfect. He walked to the other side of the gate and stopped, looking at Dominic through the black bars. Dominic let out a breath of relief. "Thank God. Elias, the system is glitched. Open it up. And pay the taxi driver. I'm out of cash." Elias didn't move. He didn't reach for the control panel. He didn't reach for his wallet. He just stood there, hands clasped behind his back, looking at Dominic with a terrifying stillness. The silence stretched between the two men, separated by 3 inches of steel. Dominic's relief began to curdle into confusion, then anger. "Did you hear me?" Dominic snapped, gripping the bars. "I said open the gate. I'm tired, I'm hungry, and I want to go to bed." "I'm afraid that isn't possible, Mr. Vane," Elias said. His voice was polite, the same tone he used to announce dinner, but there was an edge of steel underneath it. "You are not authorized to enter the premises." "Authorized? I own the premises. I am your employer. No, sir, Elias corrected. You were the husband of my employer. And as of the filing of the divorce petition and the restraining order this morning, you are technically a trespasser. Restraining order? Dominic laughed, a high, hysterical sound. She can't get a restraining order. I haven't done anything. The order cites financial abuse and imminent reputational harm, Elias recited from memory. Mrs. Vane provided the court with the video from the hospital. The judge signed it an hour ago. You are not permitted within 500 yards of the residence or Mrs. Vane's person. Dominic stared at the butler. He remembered all the times he had snapped his fingers at this man, all the times he had ignored him. Now, Elias held the keys to the kingdom, and Dominic was the beggar at the gate. Elias, please. Dominic's voice broke, shifting from anger to begging. Lexi is in the car. She's pregnant. She needs to use the bathroom. Just let us in for tonight. We'll sort it out in the morning. Just for tonight. Elias looked past Dominic at the taxi where Lexi was watching through the window. He looked back at Dominic. He remembered his own daughter lying in a hospital bed and Dominic refusing to help. He remembered Zara's kindness. There is a Motel 6 on the highway, sir, Elias said. I believe they have vacancies. You ungrateful servant. Dominic screamed, slamming his fists against the metal. I'll destroy you. I'll have you blacklisted. You'll never work in this town again. I have already submitted my resignation to the Household Staff Agency, effective upon the transition of the estate, Elias said calmly. I am now directly employed by the Sovereign Trust. My job security is quite excellent. Elias turned around and began to walk back up the driveway, his shoes crunching on the gravel. Don't you walk away from me. Dominic howled, rattling the gates like a caged animal. Elias, get back here. Elias didn't look back. But as he disappeared into the shadows of the estate, a new sound cut through the canyon air. It started as a low whine and grew rapidly into a wail. Sirens. Blue and red lights flashed against the canyon walls, drawing closer. I should mention, sir, Elias called out over his shoulder, his voice carrying in the night air. When the perimeter alarm was triggered by your unauthorized code attempts, the system automatically alerted the sheriff's department. They take trespassers very seriously in this neighborhood. Dominic froze. He looked down the road. The police cruisers were rounding the bend. He looked at the taxi driver, who was already putting the car in reverse, terrified of the drama. Dominic was trapped between the locked gate of his past life and the approaching sirens of his new reality. He had come home to rule, but he was about to be arrested on his own doorstep. Here are chapters 23, 24, and 25. These chapters deliver the emotional climax of the story, the face-to-face confrontation where the power dynamic completely flips. The arrival of the sheriff's deputies was the final public indignity. Two cruisers screeched to a halt, bathing the front gates in a chaotic wash of red and blue light. The deputies didn't approach Dominic with the deference usually reserved for billionaires. They approached him with hands on their holsters, barking commands to step away from the gate. They knew who lived here, and more importantly, they knew who signed the donation checks for the policeman's ball every year. It wasn't Dominic. It was Zara. Mr. Vane, the lead deputy said, a burly man who looked tired of rich people's drama. We have a verified trespassing complaint. You need to vacate the premises. I live here, Dominic shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the house. My clothes are in there. My medication. You can't just throw me on the street. The deputy sighed and spoke into his radio. After a brief, crackling exchange with Elias inside the house, he turned back to Dominic. Mrs. Vane has granted permission for a 10-minute supervised entry to retrieve essential personal items. 10 minutes, Mr. Vane. If you cause a scene, you leave in handcuffs. The gate clicked and swung open. Dominic walked up the long driveway, flanked by two officers, with Lexi trailing behind like a ghost. The walk felt like a death march. The house loomed above him, every window blazing with light, looking more like a fortress than a home. When he pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped into the grand foyer, he stopped dead. Zara was waiting. She stood at the top of the sweeping marble staircase, dressed in a silk robe that looked like armor. She held a glass of red wine, her posture relaxed, looking down at him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a lab rat. She didn't look angry. She didn't look sad. She looked untouchable. You called the police on me, Dominic whispered, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. In my own house. It's not your house, Dominic, Zara said, descending one step. The sound of her bare foot on the marble was louder than a shout. And it hasn't been for 12 years. I built this empire. Dominic roared, the stress finally snapping his control. He gestured wildly at the crystal chandelier, the art, the architecture. I designed every inch of this. I earned every dollar. You were just the accountant. You were just the background noise. Background noise. Zara took another step down. I was the spine, Dominic. You were just the face. And faces are replaceable. Spines are not. Today, I simply decided to stop carrying you. And look how quickly you collapsed. She reached the bottom of the stairs and stood toe-to-toe with him. She smelled of expensive soap and victory. He smelled of sweat, rain, and economy-class airplane air. The status inversion was complete. Dominic opened his mouth to argue, to gaslight, to use the same manipulation tactics that had worked for a decade, but Zara cut him off by holding up a single blue folder. Save the speech, she said. The police are on the clock. You have 8 minutes left. She tossed the folder onto the entry table. It landed with a heavy thud. What is this? Dominic asked, staring at it warily. It's the autopsy of your career, Zara replied. Inside, you will find a copy of the Sovereign Trust Incorporation papers. You will find the deed to this house, which lists the trust as the sole owner. You will find the revocation of your power of attorney. And you will find the forensic audit of the company accounts. Dominic's hands shook as he opened the folder. He scanned the pages. He saw the signatures, his own signatures, from years ago. He saw the clauses he had ignored. Moral turpitude, fidelity, termination. It was all there, a legal cage he had built for himself out of laziness and arrogance. You tricked me, he whispered, looking up at her with wet, red eyes. You set me up. I protected myself, she corrected. There is a difference. I knew who you were, Dominic, even when I loved you. I knew you were reckless. I knew you were vain. I hoped I was wrong. I hoped you would grow into the man I thought you could be. But you didn't. You grew into a thief who steals from his wife to impress a 24-year-old intern. She pointed to the document on the bottom of the stack. That is the bank transfer confirmation. I have reclaimed the $2.5 million I loaned you 12 years ago, plus interest. That is why your cards are declined. That is why your accounts are empty. I didn't steal your money, Dominic. I repossessed my investment. Dominic stared at the paper. The number stared back at him. $2,500,000. It was the exact price of the brownstone. The exact price of her father's legacy. He realized then that she hadn't just reacted to the affair. She had been keeping a ledger for 12 years, and she had finally balanced the books. You've left me with nothing, he choked out. No, Zara said coldly. I've left you with exactly what you had when I met you. A suit, a smile, and a lot of bad ideas. You're a self-made man, right, Dominic? Go make yourself again. Lexi had been standing in the shadow of the doorway, silent, listening to every word. She looked at the marble floors she thought she would walk on as the lady of the house. She looked at the folder that proved Dominic was penniless. She looked at Zara, the woman she had called old and boring, and realized she was looking at a predator who had just finished playing with her food. She walked over to the table and looked down at the documents. She read the balance sheet. Liquid assets, $0. It's true, isn't it? Lexi asked, her voice trembling. He really doesn't own any of it. He owns his clothes, Zara said, taking a sip of wine. And his debt. The rest is mine. Lexi looked at Dominic. The spell was completely broken. She didn't see a billionaire anymore. She saw a drowning man trying to pull her down with him. She placed a hand on her stomach. She had a baby coming. She needed security. She needed money. And Dominic Vane was a bad investment. I'm leaving, Lexi said. Dominic whipped around. What? Baby, no. We're in this together. We'll fight this. We'll sue her. With what money, Dom? Lexi laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. You can't even afford a lawyer. You can't even afford a taxi. I'm not going to be homeless with you. She pulled out her phone. And I'm not going down with the ship. I recorded everything, Dom. The airport. The hotel. The hospital. TMZ has already offered me $50,000 for the exclusive rights to the video diaries of the fall of Dominic Vane. That should cover my medical bills. You recorded me? Dominic gaped at her. I loved you. You loved that I was young and didn't ask questions, Lexi spat. Well, I'm asking questions now. And the answer is goodbye. She turned to Zara. For a moment, The two women looked at each other, the mistress and the wife. There was no sisterhood there, only a cold acknowledgement of reality. "Can I call a car?" Lexi asked Zara. "To get out of here?" "My driver is outside," Zara said. "He'll take you to the city. Consider it a severance package." Lexi didn't look back. She walked out the door, past the police officers, and climbed into the waiting black sedan. Dominic watched her go. He stood alone in the foyer of the house he had bragged about, stripped of his money, his mistress, and his dignity. The police officer cleared his throat. "Time's up, Mr. Vane. Grab your bag. You need to leave." Dominic looked at Zara one last time, begging for mercy with his eyes. Zara simply turned around and walked back up the stairs, taking her wine with her, leaving him in the cold, hard hands of the law. Dominic was loaded into the back of the police cruiser, his face pressed against the cold glass, watching his life recede in the rearview mirror. But inside the house, one loose end remained. Eleanor Vane stood at the top of the service stairs, clutching her jewelry box, watching the scene unfold with terror. She had bet on the wrong horse. She had spent 12 years treating Zara like an interloper, convinced that Dominic was the sun around which the world revolved. Now, the sun had burned out. She walked down the stairs, composing her face into a mask of pitiful frailty. She approached Zara, tears shimmering in her eyes, a performance that had worked on her son for decades. "Zara, darling," Eleanor quavered, reaching out a trembling hand. "Thank God you're safe. I was so worried. Dominic, he's changed. He's not the boy I raised. He manipulated me, you know? He told me terrible lies about you. I tried to defend you, but he wouldn't listen." Zara took a step back, letting Eleanor's hand grasp at empty air. She looked at the woman who had lived in her house, eaten her food, and poisoned her marriage. She remembered the phone call she had intercepted just yesterday, where Eleanor had laughed about Zara being barren and low stock. "Save it, Eleanor," Zara said, her voice flat. "I heard the call." Eleanor froze. "What call?" "The one where you told Dominic to trim the fat. The one where you called me a dried-up bean counter. You didn't defend me. You cheered for my replacement because you thought she would be easier to control." I was confused," Eleanor stammered, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit strategy. "I'm an old woman, Zara. I have nowhere to go. You can't just throw me out on the street. We're family." "We are not family," Zara corrected. "We are connected by a marriage contract that is currently being dissolved. And as for having nowhere to go, I believe Elias gave you the address of the Motel 6. Zara nodded to the open door. "Your bags are on the curb, Eleanor. My driver is taking Lexi to the city, but I'm afraid he's not taking you. You always said you liked the fresh air. You can wait for an Uber outside the gate." "This is cruel," Eleanor shrieked, dropping the mask of frailty. "You are a vindictive, hateful woman. No wonder he cheated on you." "I am a businesswoman," Zara replied, turning her back on her mother-in-law. "And I am evicting a non-paying tenant. Elias, please escort Mrs. Vane to the perimeter and ensure she doesn't take the silverware." Eleanor gasped, outraged, but Elias was already there, his hand firm on her elbow. He guided her out into the damp night air, past the manicured hedges she had never watered, and out of the gates of paradise. Zara didn't watch her go. She had already moved on to the next item on her checklist. 2 days later, Dominic sat in a small, windowless interrogation room at the county jail. He wasn't wearing an Italian suit. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit that smelled of industrial bleach. He hadn't shaved, and the dark circles under his eyes told the story of 48 hours without sleep. The door opened. He expected his high-priced lawyer. Instead, Zara walked in. She was dressed in a white power suit, immaculate and bright against the gray cinder block walls. She sat down opposite him, placing a single document on the metal table. She didn't bring a lawyer. She didn't need one. "You look tired, Dominic," she said. "Get me out," Dominic rasped. "Post the bail. I'll sign whatever you want. Just get me out of here." "The bail is set at $1 million, Zara said calmly. "Because you are considered a flight risk. And since I froze your assets, you can't pay it. But I'm not here to bail you out. I'm here to offer you a plea deal." She slid the document toward him. It wasn't a criminal plea. It was a divorce settlement. "Here is the situation," Zara explained, clasping her hands. "I have the forensic audit. It proves you embezzled $80,000 of company funds for personal use. That is a federal crime. If I hand this to the district attorney, you go to prison for 5 years. Minimum. Dominic flinched. He looked at the document. However, Zara continued, I don't want a long trial. It's bad for the stock price. So here's the trade. You sign this uncontested divorce decree. You waive all rights to the Vane Skyline shares. You waive spousal support. You admit to the infidelity and the financial misconduct in writing. In exchange, I will classify the $80,000 as a retroactive executive bonus and seal the audit. You walk away free. Broke, but free. Dominic stared at the paper. It was a total surrender. It was an admission that he was nothing. I built that company, he whispered, a tear leaking down his cheek. It's my name. It's a brand, Zara said. And brands can be rebranded. Sign the paper, Dominic. Or I walk out that door, and the next person you see is the DA. She placed a pen on the table. A cheap, plastic ballpoint. Dominic picked it up. His hand shook violently. He looked at Zara, searching for any trace of the woman who had once sold her father's house for him. He saw only a CEO negotiating a hostile takeover. He pressed the pen to the paper. He signed his name. With that scrawl, he signed away his fortune, his legacy, and his pride. Zara took the paper, checked the signature, and stood up. Goodbye, Dominic. What am I supposed to do now? He asked, his voice breaking. Work, she said, knocking on the door for the guard. It's what the rest of us do. Friday morning arrived with clear skies over New York City. The facade of the New York Stock Exchange was draped in a massive banner, but it didn't say Vane Skyline. The branding team had worked overtime. The banner read, The Phoenix Group, listing day. Inside the trading floor, the energy was electric. Zara stood on the balcony, holding the gavel. She wore the color of victory, emerald green. Beside her stood Arthur Sterling and the board, all beaming. And standing right next to her, in a tailored suit she had bought for him, was Elias. He wasn't serving drinks. He was listed on the prospectus as the Director of Internal Operations. Zara raised the gavel. The bell rang. The sound was crisp, loud, and final. Thousands of miles away, in a dingy sports bar in Los Angeles, Dominic sat on a torn vinyl stool. He had been released an hour ago. He had $40 in his pocket, the cash they returned to him upon release. He nursed a cheap beer, staring up at the TV mounted in the corner. CNBC was broadcasting live. The Phoenix Group opens at $45 a share, soaring past expectations under the leadership of interim CEO Zara Vane. Investors are praising the swift removal of former leadership as a sign of corporate maturity. Dominic watched his wife, his ex-wife, smile at the camera. She looked radiant. She looked younger. The ticker tape at the bottom of the screen scrolled the valuation, $4.2 billion. That's me. Dominic slurred to the bartender, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. I designed that. The bartender, a burly man wiping down the counter, looked at the TV, then at the disheveled man in the orange-stained undershirt. Sure you did, buddy, the bartender scoffed. And I invented the iPhone. Pay your tab, or get out. Dominic looked back at the screen just as the camera zoomed in on Zara. She looked directly into the lens, and for a second, Dominic felt she was looking right at him, sitting in the dirt while she flew. He lowered his head onto the sticky bar top and closed his eyes, the sound of the ringing bell echoing in his head like a funeral toll. 6 months later, the studio apartment in the valley smelled of ramen noodles and damp drywall. It was the only place Dominic could afford on a junior draftsman's salary. He sat at a small, wobbly drafting table, an IKEA desk, not Italian marble, squinting at a set of blueprints for a strip mall renovation. His boss, a 28-year-old kid named Kyle who used to intern at Vane Skyline, walked by and tapped his desk. Hey, Dom, I need these revisions by 5. And stop using that old-school font. It looks dated. Sure, Kyle, Dominic mumbled, gripping his pencil tight enough to snap it. I'll get it done. Great. Oh, and clean up the break room when you're done. It's your turn on the rotation. Kyle walked away. Dominic stared at the blueprints. He wasn't designing spires anymore. He was designing public restrooms for a laundromat. This was his life now. No jets. No champagne. No Lexi. Just the grinding, monotonous reality of mediocrity. He pushed his chair back and walked to the break room to get a coffee. On the table, someone had left a copy of Architectural Digest. Dominic reached for it, intending to throw it in the trash, but his hand froze. The cover. It was Zara. She was standing on the balcony of the brownstone in Boston. She had bought it back last month. The headline read, "The Architect of Justice: How Zara Vane Rebuilt an Empire and Reclaimed Her Life." Dominic stared at the photo. She wasn't just smiling. She was glowing. She looked free. He traced the letters of her name. He realized then that he had never really been the billionaire. He had just been the man standing next to the woman who was worth billions. And he had walked away from the only thing of value he had ever possessed. He dropped the magazine in the trash, poured his lukewarm coffee, and went back to drawing toilets. The gala was the event of the season. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, the same hotel that had rejected Dominic 6 months ago, was filled with the city's elite. But tonight wasn't about ego. It was about impact. Zara stood at the podium. She looked out at the sea of faces. "For years," she began, her voice ringing clear without a tremor, "I was the silent partner. I was the one who kept the lights on while someone else took the bow. I know there are thousands of women just like me. Women who sacrificed their credit, their careers, and their fathers' legacies to build men who forget their names." A ripple of applause went through the room. "That ends today," Zara continued. "I am proud to announce the launch of the Sovereign Initiative, a legal and financial defense fund dedicated to helping women recover what they invested in partners who betrayed them. We don't just help you get divorced. We help you get even." The room erupted. Standing in the front row, Elias clapped the hardest. He wiped a tear from his eye. His daughter was sitting next to him, healthy and smiling, her college tuition fully paid by the woman on stage. Zara looked down at them. She thought about the brownstone she had bought back. She thought about the clinic she was funding in Dominic's old neighborhood. She thought about the word spend of her life, how she used to spend her energy managing a narcissist's ego, and how she now spent it changing lives. She raised her glass. "To knowing your worth," she said, and adding tax. She drank the champagne. It tasted cold, crisp, and earned. The nightmare was over. The architect had fallen, but the eraser had risen. And as the camera flashed, capturing her victory for history, Zara Vane finally knew the truth. She didn't need a billionaire husband. She was the billionaire, and she was just getting started.